I'm Tom Savage, and I'm Director of Museum Affairs at Winterthur, but this weekend I'm wearing my hat as a very, very proud member of the Board of Governors of the Decorative Arts Trust, a post I've held for going on over 20 years now. I'm sure I'm getting close to my sell-by date, which is why Matt asked me to be your MC for much of this, and that is a post I hold during the New Orleans Antiques Forum, and I hope you'll return to this room and this wonderful place in August to support the historic New Orleans collection, our wonderful hosts today. I thought I would tell an anecdote before I introduce Priscilla Lawrence, the director of the collection. Many, many years ago, when a graduate student at the Cooperstown graduate program in New York, a place where I learned to miss my car from October to April because it was covered in snow, and I learned to cross-country ski, and so when it was announced that we had a chance to send graduate students to the Natchez Pilgrimage Garden Club's Antiques Forum, I raised my hand high. And with two female classmates, we decided to take in New Orleans beforehand, and I was put in charge of the arrangements, being the sort of tour leader that I am by nature. And I decided we would visit New Orleans, and I asked my then friend, or my late friend, Dodie Plateau, a former curator here, who had been an Addingham classmate, where should two attractive young women and an attractive young man stay in New Orleans that didn't cost a fortune but had historic ambiance? And she said, oh, well, that's easy, the Lamont House Hotel. So I rang them up and said, I will require 2 rooms, please, a room to be shared by 2 young ladies and a room for a single gentleman. And this sultry Blanche Dubois voice came back and said, baby, all I had left is the Scarlett O'Hara suite. And I said, I'll take it. That began a love affair with New Orleans and some extraordinary photographs that are floating around somewhere of the 3 of us fully clothed in a Prudent Millard bed. So this is a place that's grown on me, and in those 10 years of serving as the MC for the Antiques Forum, New Orleans has only begun to reveal itself. And I laugh when people say, will you go to Bourbon Street? I said, no, that's for tourists from elsewhere. That's a starter collection. And you have a chance during this forum to see the real New Orleans and some very extraordinary visits. Priscilla Lawrence, the executive director here, is among the most hospitable people I know. And this organization, I don't know how she has time to welcome us, because if you look at their magazine, it is one of the most active cultural institutions and museums in the country. While they devote a great deal of time to decorative arts and history, there is a conference virtually every day going on here, examining topics as varied as jazz and 20th century authors who visited New Orleans. It is an organization for whom I have the most enormous respect, and it's of course been under her careful guidance for 2 decades. Please enjoy a welcome to the Decorative Arts Trust from the Executive Director of the Historic New Orleans Collection, Priscilla Lawrence.
Thank you, Tom. That was really sweet. Thank you. So I don't have to tell you who I am, but I would like to tell you on behalf of our board and staff that we are delighted to have you here. We are thrilled. Welcome, and I hope you feel welcome throughout your visit. Thank you, Matt Thurlow, and all of you at the Decorative Arts Trust for your assistance with our Antiques Forum by sponsoring the Young Scholars Talk every year. We appreciate that so much and feel that you're part of this institution. We are a multi-purpose sort of organization, and I would like to tell you a little bit about us. You are going to see a lot of museums here in New Orleans, and you're going to enjoy every one of them. The Historic New Orleans Collection is an institution that you may not realize on the surface how extensive it is. We were privately founded, but of course for the benefit of the public. You've seen in your packet materials the description of a number of buildings that we occupy. And right now we have a whole complex of buildings, but basically in two campuses, for lack of a better term, one on Royal Street and one here on Charter Street. A third campus is in the works on Royal Street, and it's going to provide nearly 38,000 square feet of additional public space, including 12,000 square feet of gallery space for changing exhibitions. The expansion includes the renovation and repurposing of an 1816 multifunctional structure which faces the street. It was a home and shops. And at the rear of the historic courtyard is an all-new construction, newly constructed building, modern, state-of-the-art exhibition galleries. And it's going to give us an additional 12,000 square feet of changing exhibition galleries. There'll be semi-permanent galleries in the front building. So we're entering a new era in our existence, and we had hoped it would be finished by the time you came. It's not. In the perfect world, it would have been, but it will be soon, and it will be great. So we very much want you to come back. After, our buildings and ever-growing collections are the basis of our mission to bring the love of culture and history and the need for historic preservation to the public through our exhibition programs, our open and active research services, our significant publishing program, and the maintenance of these buildings. We have a staff of right at 120 people. And through all of the forms of outreach that we do, we feel we reach at least 300,000 people a year, probably more. So thank you for your support of what we do. Come back often, continue to be part of what we do, and thank you again.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you to the extraordinary staff of the Historic New Orleans Collection for your hospitality. Well, our journey begins this morning with an architectural survey of New Orleans architecture, and who better to lead us on that than our next speaker, Ann Masson, architectural historian at the Tulane School of Architecture. Ann is a New Orleans architectural historian who writes, teaches, and consults in the areas of architecture, antiques, and historic preservation. From 2001 to 2012, she taught in the Master's in Preservation Studies program at Tulane's School of Architecture and was assistant director of the program. Still a faculty member, she lectures and assists students in thesis work. She has an extensive background in preservation and museum work. She's taught at Colonial Williamsburg, has served on accreditations committees for the American Alliance of Museums. She's the author or editor of several publications and is completing 2 books on local architecture. An ardent advocate and volunteer for the New Orleans preservation community, Ann has served on the board as a board officer for the Friends of the Cabildo, the New Orleans Tourism Marketing Corporation, and Save Our Cemeteries, and has been president of the Beauregard Keys Historic House and Vieux Carré Property Owners, Residents, and Associates, and the French Quarter Festivals, Inc. She also serves on the collections and the building committees of the Louisiana State Museum, the Orleans Parish Landmarks Commission, and the Classical Institute of the South, about which we'll be hearing more. She's been honored with awards from the Louisiana Landmark Society, Friends of the Cabildo, Vieux Carré Property Owners, Residents and Associates, and Louisiana Association of Museums, New Orleans Magazine, and the American Council of Career Women and Vieux Carré Commission. I think she also gets an extra star in her crown. Not only is she lecturing for us today, but she's opening her house for us and says she has to get home and vacuum. Please join me in welcoming Ann Masson, who will show us glimpses of the past 300 years of New Orleans architecture.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so honored to be here, and I do hope that I will be able to offer a framework, an architectural framework, that will help you fit together some of the other pieces that you're going to see all weekend. And I know you're going to see some wonderful things. Oh, good, it works. I'm not a real PowerPoint expert, but thanks to the people at the collection, we, I think, have it together. I just want to say that you are so fortunate, and we are so fortunate, to be here in New Orleans, because nowhere in America is there a finer collection of historic buildings, many of which you'll be seeing. In spite of the loss of thousands of buildings to natural disaster, deterioration, urban renewal, and just plain old-fashionedness, we still have thousands of buildings left. In fact, whole neighborhoods have been preserved. And as you go about the city, I think you will enjoy seeing examples of so many types and styles that will be familiar to you, but all of them are uniquely New Orleans. You will also see many houses, and by some accounts, we have the finest collection of historic houses in America, and they are of infinite variety. You hardly ever see two alike. But all of our old, fine structures are united by necessary adaptations to our climate. The high ceilings, the large doors and windows located to maximize breezes, roofs designed to shed water, and of course, balconies, verandas, and porches everywhere on everything. Influenced by numerous cultures, our collection of architecture is a charming kaleidoscope of individual styles and tastes. So I hope that you will very much enjoy seeing all we have to offer in New Orleans. So to begin at the beginning, we must journey back to the founding of the city. While only one building remains from this period, the legacy of the early French engineers is quite profound. This is the earliest view of the city of New Orleans from 1726, and you can see here the little buildings arrayed against a background of swamp and forest. It was out of this wilderness that the French military engineers carved our settlement and took control of the Mississippi River Valley. They overcame floods, hurricanes, diseases, shortages, and perilous conditions to create the city in which we live. It was a difficult posting. By 1726, 3 of these military engineers had already died. They built levees, constructed fortifications, designed buildings, drained swamps, and established brickyards. In other words, they are responsible for so much, but unfortunately, they are largely forgotten. Oh dear, I need to go backwards here. Oh, I accidentally hit something. I do apologize. No, I've got it. My hand was just in the wrong place. I'm so sorry. Although founded in 1718, the real settlement of the city did not begin until engineer Adrien DePoche arrived in 1721 to lay out the city on the ground. Along with engineer-in-chief Leblanc de Latour, he devised a grid plan that drew on 17th century military planning concepts, on early 16th century Spanish precepts for laying out Spanish colonial cities, and Renaissance ideals of regularity and order. The Place d'Armes in the center, now Jackson Square, flanked by governmental and religious buildings, was a rather ambitious composition forming the town's center. DePoche divided the city's squares into 12 lots each, and many early French Quarter buildings followed these lot lines, and some of them are still followed to this day, 300 years later. When distributing land to the settlers, he placed their houses close to the streets so that, to quote, each and every one may still have some land to the rear to make a garden, which here is half of life. Now, a note on directions while we have this slide up. North, south, east, and west don't mean a lot in New Orleans. Tomorrow morning, you can go out on the riverfront right a few blocks away and watch the sunrise on the West Bank. So that makes things pretty confusing. We direct ourselves to the river, and here is the flow of the Mississippi River from left to right across the slide. The Mississippi is a constant for us, and so we say that things are upriver, downriver, to this direction, riverside, or lakeside. And you may hear these directions around town, and they make a lot of sense to us, and they also are a verbal reminder that New Orleans is forever tied to the river. It's our most important geographic point. The military engineers drew up plans for the buildings and supervised construction, but they had a challenging situation at this site because there was no stone with which they were used to building. So they immediately established brickyards for masonry construction, and they exploited the surrounding forests for cypress, which was an excellent wood for building and which is still much coveted and envied. The land was cleared, and the felled trees were hewn into heavy timber frames. And here you see those wooden elements. And this framing system was called colombage locally. It was filled in with bricks, and that gave us brick between post construction. Some of the simpler buildings used a mixture of mud, moss, and deer hair, which was called bousillage. And so these were vulnerable to the elements, and most of these buildings were covered with planking or stucco on the outside. Notice there are two different examples of the French roof truss systems that were used at this time, and they shed water easily and were also fairly easy to construct. These colombage frames have another advantage, and that is that they are lightweight compared to masonry construction. So often you have a building with a masonry ground floor and colombage floor above, because it was just so much lighter, and our foundations in the swampy water were a bit tricky. These engineers skillfully adapted the European building traditions that they knew to the environment here in New Orleans, with damp, rot, and rising water totally prevalent. Their ideas were so influential that local design, almost to the present day, was profoundly influenced by them. With a fairly small architectural vocabulary, the engineers designed the parish church, the convent, administrative buildings, barracks, warehouses, a guardhouse, a jail, a horse and wind-powered mill, houses, kitchens, a hospital, and other buildings. Although simple in design, the structures echoed the French architecture during the period of Louis XIV. I show you here a picture of the convent building, the design drawn by Francois-Ignace Brutin. Oh, why is it moving forward? I'm not touching anything. Okay, I am sorry, I do apologize. Brutin's drawing from 1745 shows the convent building that the Ursuline nuns lived in as they carried about their duties of taking care of the orphans and the ill in the city. The building replaced an earlier one that deteriorated rapidly and indeed nearly collapsed because the colombage frame and the soft brick fill were exposed to the elements. So Brutin built this building, and the nuns resided here until 1824, surrounded by a series of auxiliary buildings and also beautiful orchards and gardens. The convent still exists today. It is the property of the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and the building is open to the public as a museum and also some administrative buildings. If you go there, which I hope you have time to do, please take particular note of the stairway. It was saved from the 1734 convent and is built of solid blocks of cypress. It's really a wonderful thing to see. So even though we only have one French colonial building, the engineers gave us many types and styles, which we still use today. Their legacy was the development of the raised gallery house, which gave birth to an entire genre of city and country buildings designed in various styles, from including the stately Greek Revival. But these early buildings in the French style established the type. A visitor described it better than I can. The galleries are usually 8 or 9 feet wide. These wide galleries have several advantages. First, they prevent the sun's rays from striking the walls of the house, and thus to keep them cool. Also, they form a convenient and pleasant spot on which to promenade during the day. One can eat or entertain here, and very often during the hot summer nights, one sleeps here. This idea is confirmed by the 1792 inventory at Destrehan Plantation, where the galleries contained 6 large, heavy cotton or canvas curtains, cypress bedsteads furnished with mattresses, feather beds, bolsters, sheets, quilts, and mosquito nets. I just don't know why it's advancing without me. This did not happen before, you all. This is a slide of Madame John's legacy. The little drawing was by Boyd Cruz, who was the first director of the Historic New Orleans collection here, and he is depicting Madame John's legacy. This building was built immediately after the fire of 1788, well into the Spanish colonial period, but it follows the designs for French colonial houses at the time. And notice that it's raised above the ground, principally because of the danger of flood. The high water table precluded basements, so this lower ground floor could be tall enough to be used for storage or auxiliary living space, and dining rooms were sometimes placed on the ground floor, which we would think of as damp and dark, which was really cool and dark in the summertime. One person said in 1803, another reason for raising the houses: the more houses are elevated, the more they are cooled by the wind, and their especial advantage is that they are much less bothered by mosquitoes, which are continually blown away by the wind. I'm not sure that that was true. The next generation of this sort of house is what we would call the Plantation House, and you will see them, and I'm sure some of you have seen them in the countryside. As the styles of the 19th century moved on, the simple wooden columns and posts that supported the French colonial galleries were replaced by large brick columns, sometimes with a sophisticated classical design, and often encircling the entire building to create those galleries that were so useful. Not everyone lived in these fine conditions. Most people dwelt in simple wooden frame buildings with cypress shake roofs. None remain today. The Spanish, who took possession of the city in 1768, 7 years after the transfer treaty, apparently continued to build in this fashion and continued to use the old buildings that had been built by their French predecessors. Unfortunately, we know little about the buildings of this late Spanish colonial period because there was a terrible fire in 1788 and another in 1794. On Good Friday, March 21st, 1788, a fire began in the home of the royal treasurer on Charter Street, only a half a block from the main square and just a couple of blocks from where we are right now. Apparently, in honor of the occasion, candles were burning on a makeshift altar. The wind caught them, and they were caught on fire by some candles nearby. One description reads, "One can imagine what a fire this must have been in a city of highly combustible wooden houses. in the place where a few hours before were populous neighborhoods, streets filled with carriages and pedestrians, stores filled with goods and bustling with trade, now was only to be seen a sterile plain whitened with ashes. The citizen could not even recognize the house from which he had just escaped, and he wandered bewildered through his former neighborhood, carrying the pitiful remnant of his property, having not even a place to rest his head. What a sad account. 3/4 of the city had been destroyed. The populace rushed to the levee where there was safety, and the governor opened the royal warehouses, and he sent to the planters and asked them to send their provisions because the population was in danger of starvation. So about 850 buildings were lost, including all of the buildings around Jackson Square, or at the back of Jackson Square, the most important buildings in the city. The Cabildo, the Presbytere, the parish church, the guardhouse, the prison, all of them were destroyed. In the rebuilding, we see this here in a Spanish colonial era depiction. In the rebuilding, the area at the back of the square was most important to the population. And so they appealed to Don Andres Almonaster y Rojas, who was paying for the new church and the presbytere, which is the building on your right, the Cabildo being the building on your left, upriver of the church. And he agreed to finance for the city of New Orleans the building of the Cabildo. His intention was to, quote, to make the front of the plaza uniform, which in fact would beautify it, as the two buildings will form two equal wings to the temple, meaning St. Louis Parish Church. So he had a really Renaissance symmetrical idea here. The French engineers had the same idea, but they never lived they never lived to see it brought to fruition. Notice the Cabildo and the presbytere both have a different kind of roof than they do today. A pediment over a temple front, and then this was a terrace roof, which I will describe in a minute, surrounded by a balustrade and ornamented with urns and other decorative classical features. So this is how the buildings looked for the first half of the 19th century. Then the church was replaced, and mansard roofs were added to the Cabildo and the presbytere. This shows the Cabildo in the 1830s. Both of those buildings, along with the church, were designed by architect and city engineer Gilberto Guillemard, who worked in a neoclassical style that was quite similar to buildings then being erected in Havana. And at that point in history, New Orleans answered to Havana. And so it is natural that we should see some similarity of building style. I want to particularly point out the ironwork on the Cabildo. This is on the St. Peter Street side. This is wrought iron, which, as you know, was forged with a hammer on an anvil with heat. And we had a great deal of this, beautifully crafted, either locally or imported. And it's just this wonderful, simple, curvilinear, and later slightly geometric kind of ironwork. Unfortunately, most of it has disappeared, and you'll have to look hard to find some examples. But the Cabildo and presbytere are outstanding in this regard. Almost all the ironwork that you will see in the city is cast iron, which was poured into a mold. And so you can get all those decorative grapevines and roses and patterns that the mid-19th century really admired and enjoyed. During the Spanish colonial period, and especially after the fires, with so many people needing housing, the Creole Cottage became one of the most popular house types, not only in the French Quarter, but in the nearby suburbs, especially Tremé and Marigny. The Creole Cottage is composed of just 4 rooms, opening one to another, and in the back you would have a loggia flanked by cabinets, known to us as the cabinet loggia. And this was it, no hallways. They were easy to construct and fairly compact, and you could have them of solid masonry, brick between posts, or entirely frame. So it was a quite versatile type That could be a nice house for a prosperous merchant, or it could be a very simple house for a family of workers. In the courtyards to the rear were all the service buildings that you needed. Kitchens and laundries, privies, quarters for the servants, extra living space. This little slide of 3 Creole cottages on St. Philip's Street shows a progression. The one in the middle from 1805 is typical of the very early Creole cottages, quite simple and low to the ground, and it is flanked by 2 slightly later examples. The one with the double dormers is detailed in the Greek Revival style. So the Creole cottage, which was popular from the 1790s into the 1840s, just followed the fashions along. Benjamin Latrobe, when he visited, said, "These one-storied houses are very simple in their plan. The 2 front rooms open onto the street with French glass doors. Those on one side are the dining and drawing rooms, on the other the bed chambers. The front rooms, when inhabited by Americans, are the family rooms, and the back rooms the bed chambers." So we see here, even at this early period, the contrast between how a Creole family, meaning a French and Spanish descent, or an American family of Anglo descent, how they might live differently in their homes. Now, just a moment about the terrace roof, which you will not see, but was such an interesting thing. Building regulations instituted by the Cabildo after the 2 fires, 1788, followed 6 years later by another major fire, were very strict about the wooden construction. But they also said that all the buildings in the central part of the city had to have fireproof roof construction. And so a new idea came up from the Spanish colonial world, and this was the terrace roof. And they're nearly flat. Here is Latrobe's drawing of one, and improbably they are built up of layers of beams, planking, plaster, tar, and terracotta tiles surfaced with lime and oyster shells. A traveler said, "The tops of the houses are as their backyards. The women wash, iron, sit to work, and the men walk on them and go from the top of one house to the top of another and visit their neighbors without ever having anything to do with the streets below. Many have shrubs and flowers growing on them." The traveler went on to say that they never leaked. Well, this was just not true. They leaked like sieves. Not only the roofing material, but the water flowed down the walls. So it's no surprise that they were rather shortly replaced by slate roofs, particularly, that were starting to come in, or barrel tile roofs. And so we only have one example left. I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the cemeteries. They're so different from ours and have been the objects of curiosity and even horror for visitors for almost 2 centuries. They are the product of a high water table and the well-established Spanish colonial preference for entombment over burial below ground. And those 2 factors established the design. The earliest, St. Louis No. 1, was authorized by the Cabildo in 1789 and moved to its present location in 1796. It replaced an overcrowded, below-ground French burial ground that was located here in the French Quarter. This 1834 watercolor by Latrobe's son, John H.B. Latrobe, shows the below-ground burial and the low tombs, which you see here, as well as the plethora of tombs in all sorts of styles and designs. All the cemeteries at this time in New Orleans were Catholic. Later on, of course, we have Protestant and Jewish burial spots as well. But please go see the cemeteries. They're most interesting. The Louisiana Purchase took place, of course, in 1803, and after that point, settlers from other parts of the United States began to pour into the city. The well-established building traditions, however, prevailed, and it was quite a while before the Anglo taste took hold in New Orleans. This depiction of the city at that time is taken from the Bernard de Marigny plantation, just below the French Quarter, and it became one of the newest suburbs. with the need for housing for the new settlers coming in from the East Coast, and also the refugees from Saint-Domingue, who had begun arriving about 10 years before, there was a great need for housing. And so they opened up new suburbs, downriver and upriver, and the Marigny Plantation was one of the first. It was very attractive, along with the Tremé subdivision and the French Quarter. It was very attractive to the free people of color, many of whom were quite skilled and well-educated, and they built a number of French Quarter houses and lived here. In addition to the Creole Cottage, in the early American period, Creole townhouses were built by merchants and prosperous families. They drew on the Spanish colonial idea of a two-story dwelling with auxiliary buildings surrounding an internal courtyard. These buildings often housed shops on the ground floor with the family quarters above. Now, the Creole townhouse literally turned its back on the street. You entered via a small alley to the side or in the middle. And then when you reached the courtyard to the rear, there was a beautiful, sometimes quite grand, stairway leading up to the living quarters above. The type was popular from about 1800 well into the 1830s, when this large kind of fancy example was built. One description says the houses facing the levee are of 2 stories, with a gallery in the front, and of course they had balconies as well, as no cellar can be dug in this flat country. The first story is appropriated as a warehouse, a carriage house, office, etc., after the Spanish fashion. The family resides on the second floor and the back buildings for kitchens and Negroes. In the more commercial districts, we also had houses that have the living quarters above, the shop below, and an entresol, or sort of half-story, fitted in between. This is an old European idea that was used for storage of goods, or maybe for offices and clerks, or even sometimes for sleeping accommodations. So look for these particularly on Royal Street in various styles. By 1826, when the Beauregard Kai's house was being built, the new American ideas were really coming to the fore. The raised house might now have a portico supported by classical columns. Double-hung and triple-hung windows began to replace the French doors and windows of the earlier period. And we also see the beginning of the move to red brick construction. These were northern brick that were highly fashionable and highly valuable. And we see here the Herman Grima house, which imitates the look of these wonderful northern brick with paint. But it was, these houses were detailed also with late Georgian or Federal, if you prefer, details. And here we see the double-hung windows. But you see still the large openings, the shutters, which were needed for the inclement weather, and other features which do relate it to the earlier 18th century architecture. But this was not where the action was in the 1830s. You have to go uptown for that. And to go uptown, upriver, you have to cross Canal Street. This is a very early view of Canal Street, and I really like it because you can see lined up here the omnibuses that were mule-drawn, and it was these carriages that brought people upriver on the same route that we use today. So if you take the streetcar, you are following the path of originally the mule-drawn omnibuses and later the steam-powered, and now, of course, they're electrical. So the first uptown suburb opened was the Faubourg St. Mary. This is now the Central Business District, or CBD, as we call it. And you see some of the kinds of buildings that existed at the time. It was a brand new subdivision to be populated mostly by Anglos from the East Coast, from Scotland, from Ireland, from all over the British Isles. And along the riverfront, they established the port uses. Behind that were foundries and all sorts of other businesses. The main streets, such as Canal Street, had shops and fancy offices and insurance companies, all sorts of great buildings. And with few exceptions, the architecture styles were not those that you have seen heretofore and that you will see in the Quarter and downriver suburbs, but they were in the new American styles, such as the Greek Revival, the most impressive example remaining of which is Gallier Hall. It was originally completed about 1850 to serve as the second municipality hall, later became the City of New Orleans Hall, and it is still used, owned by the city and used for receptions and so forth. Beautiful example of the Greek Revival designed by Irish-born architect James Gallier Sr. It's built of granite and marble, and it's quite the grand building. It overlooks Lafayette Square, which was the American equivalent of the Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square. We also had some very fine buildings in the Gothic Revival taste, which was never as popular anywhere as the Greek Revival. But here we have churches, a few houses. This is the wonderful St. Patrick's Church, built by the Dagan brothers out of New York. The interiors, however, were done by James Gallier Sr. in the Gothic Revival style. He was versatile. And if you have a moment to visit there, please go inside if it's open. It is the most splendid Gothic Revival interior, completely restored and kept up. Even the cypress pews are original. It's just quite beautiful. But you can see from this slide that this was quite an active and Americanized area. Many hundreds of townhouses were built, either in rows, such as we have here, or singly. The rows, this being a famous one called the 13 Sisters, there are 13 townhouses, usually had balconies, not verandas or galleries. They featured the famous red brick from the north, and many of them were classically detailed. Unfortunately, many of these are gone now, but we do have a few good examples to see. But this idea of the side hall townhouse, an American idea, caught fire in New Orleans. And so for the rest of the century, we see them built in frame, in masonry, in the CBD, in uptown neighborhoods, especially in the Garden District. And here's just one example on Esplanade Avenue that shows how the later Italianate was a popular style for the side hall townhouses. Now we're really going to head uptown, and rather than using an historic map, I wanted you to see the amount of the city that is under historic district control one way or another. We are here in the French Quarter. You'll be visiting the Garden District, which is here, and I'll mention the Irish Channel. And these are all the wonderful uptown suburbs, the former city of Carrollton, of course now part of us, and the downtown suburbs as well. So this gives you an idea of how the city followed the curve of the river, and also the omnibus/streetcar followed the curve of the river. Now, in this area, which was known as the city of Lafayette in the Garden District, this was developed in 1832 by American investors who paid about $500,000 for this large plot of land that went all the way to the river. Closer to the river were port uses, tanneries, and such, backed by small frame houses mostly for workers. That's now known as the Irish Channel. But in the area close to St. Charles, higher ground and a better building land, you had a wonderful neighborhood and a beautiful neighborhood. The Daily Delta in 1847 described it better than I can. The rear of Lafayette, as it was then Lafayette City, is most beautifully situated for dwelling houses. The ground is high and dry, and vegetation flourishes in it in amazing luxuriousness. Here are collected many handsome villas with gardens and large yards, and who seem to us crowded denizens of New Orleans, emerging from our little narrow damp yards to be perfect princes of luck and happiness. So there is this distinction between the Creole, Spanish, French, damp, small, crowded, and these beautiful lots and buildings of the Garden District. This is the famous Buckner House, beautiful Greek Revival design. These houses, some were quite large and even occupied a quarter of a square. I like the Italianate ones. I think that they are just so pretty with the shadows from their verandas. Of these houses, Mark Twain said, "These mansions stand in the center of large grounds and rise, garlanded with roses, out of the midst of swelling masses of shining green foliage and many-colored blossoms. No houses could well be in better harmony with their surroundings or more pleasing to the eye." He also said, "All the dwellings have a comfortable look. Those in the wealthy quarter are spacious, painted snowy white usually, and generally have wide verandas or double verandas supported by ornamental columns." So you'll be seeing a number of these buildings on your tours, and you will also notice too that squeezed in among are Queen Anne houses and smaller dwellings, and just be aware that many of these large quarter lots were sold off sometime in the 19th or 20th century by their owners, and new infill structures, many of them quite nice and lovely in themselves, now enhance the Garden District. Meanwhile, back in the Creole area, in the Old City in the Vieux Carré, mid-19th century residents realized that their businesses and even their culture were about to be eclipsed by the Anglo-Americans. So in addition to erecting a splendid new hotel and commercial structures, they decided to renovate, essentially, the area around Jackson Square. The centerpiece was the new St. Louis Cathedral in the center, designed by French-born architect Jacques Depoche in the latest French Romantic taste. The fence around Jackson Square was replaced, the whole was replanted and replanned so that it became an urban promenade rather than a parade ground for the military. Beautiful fence was added. The Andrew Jackson statue was erected in 1856, the Clark Mills statue. And then the mansard roofs and cupolas were added to the presbytere and the cabildo. Alongside Jackson Square, we see the really extraordinary Pontalba buildings, which were built as townhouses, not apartments, although they're apartments today, but they were not townhouses. They were not apartments, they were townhouses. And they were built by the Baroness Pontalba, whose father, Almonaster, had paid for so much of the renovation around Jackson Square in the Spanish colonial period. A close-up of her buildings reveals the wonderful red brick with the granite columns below, and most striking is the cast iron veranda, which reaches out over the sidewalk, a fairly new idea at the time. If you go there, of course, notice the cartouche in the middle, which contains the entwined initials of Almonaster and Pontalba. Now, everybody thought this was a great idea to steal a bunch of land from the city of New Orleans by building over the sidewalks. But it also provided something for the citizens: shade from the sun, protection from the rain. So many of the wonderful wrought iron balconies were torn down, remelted, and cast iron verandas were added to early buildings. This is an 1832 red brick townhouse, or stucco townhouse. And you can see that the veranda additions all over the quarter would really have changed the look of the neighborhood. So back uptown again, remembering that the streetcar carried everyone to these new suburbs. I want to mention houses like this. There are thousands of them, and no two alike. The uptown suburbs above the Garden District were primarily built up between 1870 and World War I. Most are frame. They are in so many different styles and types, you can hardly name them. Cottages, shotguns, mansions, doubles, singles, camelbacks, two-story homes. Some are simple, some are grand, but most of them incorporate some sort of millwork detail, this beautiful sawn cypress wood. One of the newspapers said, "The old-fashioned straight up and down box houses are, we are pleased to see, giving way to those more elegant in design, thus proving that our citizens are becoming imbued with a taste for the beautiful in architecture. But maybe best of all in vernacular architecture are the shotgun houses. And we have so many left, it's just unbelievable, even after we lost so many in Katrina. Whole streets are composed, even whole neighborhoods are mostly shotguns. And they were well suited to the long, narrow lots and the limited drained ground in New Orleans. But the story goes that if you stand in the front door and fire a shotgun, it will go out the back, the shot will go out the back without hitting anything. Now, if you think of that for a moment, you will realize it's an absurd concept, would never work, but that's what we call them. So we have single shotguns, double shotguns. I like single shotgun, another single shotgun. I wanted to show you this one because you can see how people really live in them to this day. No, they're not perfectly restored, and there's a chain link fence. But at the same time, they have this feel that they have always been there, lived in by New Orleanians, which is true. Now, the double shotgun was normally used by two families, one on each side, so it's 2 rooms wide. Then there's the Camelback Shotgun. It has an additional raised portion in the rear that could be entered generally from the outside and might even have been used for rental apartments. The millwork industry worked out the swamps, cut all the timber in the late 19th century, but until that time it employed many New Orleanians and enhanced many wonderful buildings. Now, we also followed some trends in public buildings. I'm not going to say much about this, but I will mention the 1888 building, the Howard Library, in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. In fact, it was built after Richardson died. He was a native New Orleanian by his firm. So be looking for some outstanding public buildings of the late 19th and early 20th century. But mostly you'll be seeing, I think, these houses. This wonderful one on St. Charles Avenue, which due to the City Beautiful movement and the expansion of wealth in New Orleans at that time, St. Charles Avenue became the place to live. So we see houses in the Romanesque Revival, in the Queen Anne, and even in, we call this the Wedding Cake House. Of course, it's Georgian Revival, but what Georgian, huh? Just beautiful. Across the street from where we sit, you'll see our best example of the Beaux-Arts style in New Orleans, the Supreme Court building, built in 1906. I'm just showing you an entrance. I hope you'll at least walk around and have a look at it. During the 20s and 30s, our central business district developed, as many did, across the country, a combination of old and new and ever larger and taller office buildings. New Orleans advertised itself as a modern city with an impressive financial district, a thriving port, and a well-developed central business district. But down in the Creole suburbs, this was what was happening. At the same time that progress was a watchword in the city, citizens realized that valuable old buildings were falling to the wrecking ball and to deterioration. So they mobilized. 100 years ago, artists, writers, business people, uptown ladies, women advocates, suffragettes, all took up the cause of preserving our older neighborhoods. And this, of course, is a slide of the Ursuline Convent with the neighborhoods and the river spread out behind it. And this preservation movement, I just want to say that everything that you will be seeing as you go around New Orleans is due to a century of work by neighborhood organizations and individuals dedicated to the preservation of this city. People have worked hard for all these years to keep our city as intact as we could. And going forward, we have a wonderful new generation of people who are moving towards this and finding new ways of using our old buildings. And so I hope you will also appreciate, in addition, the architecture, the work that has gone in to preserving it. And I think of you all as New Orleans preservationists. And so I thank you very much this morning for listening to this talk, and I hope that there will be something here for each of you to take away that will be useful in your stay. So thank you so very much.